Okay, guys, let's acknowledge the elephant in the room. Or, rather, the giant fire-breathing dragon. For Honor has definitely seen a shift in its overall focus and narrative, and I'd like to talk about that today. The question about For Honor becoming too fantasy has been raised since around year 3 or 4, when Fieries, Wyverns, and Draconite were introduced. With the Jormungandr event and Hitakiri's haunting ghost powers, you could argue those are just legends or myths being told. Almost like a tall tale to explain how the Vikings lost to Hitakiri and why the Knights lost to Jormungandr. You technically could argue they are just made-up stories, since they're just simple event modes that don't necessarily have to be canon. But with Draconite, you can't dismiss that. That's not a myth anymore. A supernatural rock or substance that can poison people, heal people, and corrupt people. Feels like we're stepping into Lyrium territory in Dragon Age, doesn't it? But it's stuff like that that leads to the common question in the For Honor community that I've seen pop up a lot, and even more so with the reveal of this new year and season. As dragons fly across the sky in For Honor, a question has finally reached the surface to the point I can't ignore it anymore. Has For Honor become way too fantasy now? Before we get into this conversation, let's go ahead and debunk a very early argument that I hear a lot.
For Honor was always built to be a historical game where there is no fantasy, so adding any fantasy is already criminal.
Look, I hear this quite a bit, so let's debunk this right away. From the very beginning of its creation, For Honor has had fantasy elements. From its mechanics and combat to its lore, there has been an element of the fantastic. The Cataclysm shaking the world to the extent that Knights, Vikings, and Samurai would end up encountering each other? How does that correlate? Minions all being easily slain with a single strike to the point of a single warrior could it just destroy a whole group of them with a single blow? Armor being irrelevant to the battlefield? I mean, let's face it, if this were truly historically sound, knight armor would make the knights near untouchable. But we have to abandon some degree of reality just to make the game function. But okay, I know what you're thinking. Raven, that's semantics and game mechanics, right? There's simply no excuse for everything else the devs have been doing lately, right? You can't excuse that so easily. Can we all agree the developers have definitely steeped deeper into the fantasy now and that it's starkly different from what we started with? And to that, yeah, that's without question. With the arrival of literal dragons, the Holy Grail, and runes and glyphs and some elvish-looking mythical outfits and all these other elements of fantasy, I think we can officially say that For Honor has definitely abandoned its historical accuracy for a lot more fantasy. So, I'll grant you that. But here's the real question. Is that a bad thing? Have we strayed so far into high fantasy nature in this world that it's actually ruined the game? Because that's the debate that's going on. I'd like to explore this debate and offer my points to this conversation. Now, when I hear this debate, I hear two sides of the argument. Let's focus on the first one. On this side, I hear people say that this is a fine decision to make. After all, fantasy is creative and offers new ideas and opportunities for the creators to add new things, new cosmetics, new executions, and new possibilities. The more avenues you have to travel, the more prospects as well. Besides, as long as it doesn't ruin the core gameplay, the developers should have the freedom to add what they want to this game. The fantasy is all background anyway, and there's some truth to that I have to admit. If you take out the dragons flying around and the Holy Grail, has this game really changed gameplay-wise? The movesets haven't changed. And any magical additions are limited only to event modes, which can be written off as non-canon, mythical outfits, or effects that have existed even as far back as year 2. I mean, can you really excuse some of the fire or mythical or fairy-style effects that have been added? Can you say that those are too fantasy? If you remove those and demand only historically accurate effects, you wouldn't really have that many, but we'll get more into that later. The overall aspect of real warriors fighting other real warriors still remains the same overall, so for many, fantasy was always a possibility in a world like For Honor, since the very idea of knights, samurai, and Vikings fighting is a hypothetical in the first place, so why not provide more hypotheticals? If you are to build a world and reality that couldn't possibly exist without the fantastical intervening, why not see what more fantastical you could do with it? After all, I get many people in my comment sections who accuse me of missing the point of For Honor by making it all about history. It usually goes something like this.
It's not a history game. Stop grading the executions and movesets so seriously. You need to lighten up and respect that it's fantasy and these things could just never happen, so just accept the silliness and craziness and stop making it so realistic. You grade it too seriously.
Yeah, there are people like that out there who do lean on the idea that For Honor is just so fantasy that we should really just accept it that way and be treated as such. But as much as I understand these stances, the problem with the stance come down to three things. One, even though you say it isn't, it kind of is impacting the core gameplay now. Two, though the fantasy elements are mostly in the background, they are manipulating you into excusing the foreground changes being made. And three, if we must accept that fantasy is a natural part of For Honor, then how far is too far? And that's a dangerous question to ask. Now, most would agree that the whole fantasy thing became pretty obvious, say, at least around Warmonger and her Draconite corruption feats. I mean, sure, questionable at first. You could basically have it explained away as alchemy or based on some kind of bioweapon. After all, humanity isn't unfamiliar with using biological warfare in medieval times, and being exposed to certain minerals can have toxic consequences. But the more we started to just accept Draconite, the more the devs could expand its use, like making Griffin's use of it more healing-oriented. That kind of shocked us for a bit. Okay, so this material that could hurt us now can heal us? That's a little questionable. But since we accepted what they did with Warmonger, we more readily accepted what it did with Griffin. And after we kind of nodded and accepted that reality, we got Kyoshin in his fourth feat. You can't excuse that with bioweaponry. That's a supernatural spell of some kind. How do you rationalize it? And here's what I usually hear. Well, he's a spiritual warrior. Perhaps he has some spiritual skill set, or maybe it's hypnotism of some kind. Fine excuses, but do you see how slowly it becomes harder and harder to excuse the obvious fantasy elements inserting themselves into the world of For Honor and core gameplay? See, it's not just background anymore. The developers are now adding it to the gameplay. So that begs the question, why? And how do they get away with it? Well, it's mostly because the fantasy elements in the background help kind of prepare us for it. Think about Kyoshin's event game mode before the hero was released. It showed us spiritual warriors, fantasy-style powers, and new enlightened visuals. So when Kyoshin arrived, we were kind of prepared for his supernatural capabilities. We kind of expected them because the hints and reveals to him were very supernatural. We might not have liked it, but we were able to more easily accept it without throwing a fit. It comes down to how far you can extend your suspension of disbelief. How far are you willing to stretch before you know you've jumped the shark? And for everyone, it's a little different. For some, none of these feats hurt anything, they can extend their disbelief just a little further. But for others, it's just too much and it distracts them. And as for the For Honor is fantasy by nature argument, by that logic, we can't criticize any choice made because then it would all come down to personal preference. By that line of thinking that fantasy is just a part of For Honor's nature and anything should be excused, Warden should now have a feat where he can call down holy strikes from heaven that vaporize the minion lane. Griffin should be able to summon up Zeus's lightning bolts and hurl them at a distance. Shaman should literally shapeshift into a wolf and go werewolf mode. And Shinobi should be able to summon 100 Shadow Clones Naruto style and have them just bum rush every single zone in Dominion. Hell, let's also have Zanhu firebend like Prince Zuko. Who needs to throw fire kunai or fire traps or anything when he can just punch and fire is produced? Now I know, all of those additions sound outlandish, and you think, they'd never do that. And I agree, at this state of the game, no, they wouldn't add those silly things, but how far are we from that? And that is the major fear of the other side of the argument. If we're now willing to allow dragons into For Honor, literal dragons, how long until these fantasy elements turn For Honor into a game it wasn't? And for some, you might say, well, I don't care, they can add that if they want. But for a lot of fans, that is what they're afraid of. They like the historical feel and don't want to see all those things. For some of us, these changes might seem awesome, kick-ass, and enjoyable, but for many, as badass as they might be, it would create a divide. A divide that would kind of ruin the experience for us. We couldn't overlook the supernatural aspects of the game anymore and lose some of the original charm we had for the game. Fantasy may be a part of For Honor, but it was always a background element. As it now seeps further and further into the foreground, the fear is growing that For Honor will eventually cave to it altogether. And that is my message to you who support the fantasy aspect. I respect it, but understand the other side of the argument. Now that we've looked at that side of the argument and debate, let's take a look at the other side of the debate. On this side of the debate, they say this is a bad thing because this much fantasy breaks immersion. Since For Honor sold itself as a semi-realistic game, The game going this far south has officially ruined the immersion and intention the game initially had, which was this realistic debate about knights, Vikings, and samurai. For Honor never sold itself as a fantasy game, and we want it to be all historical. I actually agree with a lot of this argument, as I too was sold on For Honor as historical. I actually agree with most of this argument, as I too was sold on For Honor as a historical game, and that's why I built most of my channel around discussing the historical nature of the heroes, their executions, their armor, and their martial capabilities. I want to treat For Honor with the dignity that comes from recognizing its historical roots, and I too feel a little shocked by fantasy elements beginning to become more and more commonplace. However, the problem with this line of thinking is two things. One, trying to remove fantasy altogether will inevitably lead to roadblocks. And two, removing fantasy and keeping it only historically based will restrict the game's ability to expand itself. Here's the unfortunate fact about history. It's all based on objectivity. For example, it's an objective truth. Samurai and knights never fought each other. They were too far apart. In order for us to even have For Honor in the first place, we need to twist history enough to allow them to meet. Sure, nothing too fantastical about that necessarily, but eventually it will get harder and harder to twist history to suit what we want the game to add. For example, I've had comments saying that they want Raider to have plate mail, but Vikings never wore plate mail. To do this properly, we need to again twist the culture and history of the Viking people so he wears it. Then I remember, long before the pirate hero ever showed up, people were saying, we want a pirate hero. Well, considering pirates had guns, and there was an obvious issue with having guns in the game at the time, we've had to twist some history and twist some objectivity to create a pirate in the game. Sure, these are all small things right now, minor things that can be solved with simple tweaks or additions, but what happens when those ideas run dry? Let's use an example. Take Warmonger and Warden. The major complaint of Warmonger is that she's just a better Warden. So why didn't they just remake Warden and give him Warmonger's armor and moveset? Why make a whole new character? Well, two reasons. Players would complain about no new characters being added, and it would have upset everyone who enjoyed the original Warden style. So a new character was born. But again, she's just Warden with a unique moveset. Her sword, animation, and even overall look is very much like Warden, so how can we make her stand out? Can we look to history to help us? Well, yes, but history provides us little to go off of, if that would possibly give us Warden. Yes, but history provides us little to go off of that we couldn't possibly give to Warden too. After all, anytime we look at history and say, okay, on this one hand we have a classic knight in the Warden, now we look at Warmonger and see a classic knight with slightly better armor. And a sword that's incredibly similar. So how do we make them different? Well, let's dip our hands a little bit into the fantasy. We give her corruption. Yes, it's a slight stretch. It's a bit fantastical. But it creates a clear difference between a Warmonger playstyle and a Warden that cannot be disputed. But there's an even bigger issue that For Honor faces, and it's the one that I think a lot of people are concerned with. Have you heard the phrase, history repeats itself? There's a reason for that. In fact, you could argue Astria's rise is just a repeat of Apollyon. And Apollon's whole plan was to repeat the war of the past to create a new war. That's what would happen as the seasons go on if we base everything on history. For one season, the knights will rise up and cause trouble. But then in the next season, the Vikings will do that. And then the samurai will do that. And then once they've all done that, well, now we need another reason to fight. Let's have the knights come back and cause trouble again. Because history repeats. Over time, as you run out of reasons for them to fight, eventually you start seeing a repetitive play. I think there becomes a problem of repetitive plot structure when every year and every season feels the same as the last one. Now, a creative writer can find ways to avoid this, adding new leaders to the factions, new motivations, new goals and minds, and other such things. But remember this, there is a never-ending demand for new content. And new content that takes a long time to come out is evidence of bad game to most of the community. It puts pressure on the developers to abandon methods that would take more time than others. Think of it like this. If you have a very creative writing team who really wants to keep For Honor based on history, but it takes them time to do historical research and planning and narrative work to make everything work in a realistic way, That means that 1, you're not going to get as many cosmetics. 2, you're not going to have as many creative looking effects, especially ones that look too supernatural. Got to keep those supernatural effects out of the game. Can't add those because no fantasy, remember. We got to keep it all historical. It takes a long time to find unique and creative things to add. And if it takes a long time, what's the complaint from the community?
They don't add anything new. Game bad, game dead, we don't like.
So, the answer is simple. They go to the easy solution. Rather than take time and upset the community, they create scenarios, motives, and events that correlate with a fantasy element, because not only is that easier to do, but it also allows them to draw inspiration from other sources, movies, and TV shows, things that people might be familiar with. It's just easier that way. I'm not saying better, I'm saying easier. That may explain why they've started leaning more on fantasy. By leaning more on fantasy, it opens new avenues for new emotes, new effects, new mythic outfits, new illustrious outfits, abilities, event modes, all these things that can connect to the themes of fantasy that they want to add to the season or to the new characters or to what have you. And by doing this, it allows them to have consistent and constant content updates. And before you say, well, we'd rather have quality over quantity, you may feel that way. But remember, one of the major complaints about For Honor for after year 1 when the heroes stopped coming out was dead game, no new content. Eventually the creators had to make a decision, and whether you like it or not, that decision was to start leaning a bit more on fantasy. Now, where do I stand in this debate? Now that we've looked at both sides, their pros and their cons, where do I stand? Here's my stance. I think the gradual shift towards fantasy was actually inevitable. I think it was assured to happen. Unfortunately, it is a sad sign. Look, like I said, the game always possessed a slight fantasy element in the background that was easily dismissed, and creative writing teams work to keep the realism of the game in the foreground. But as this takes time, creativity, and effort to do well, and the community keeps becoming hostile to the developers for a lack of regular, meaningful content, I think the developers were pressured to start running to easier and simpler solutions. Guys, look, they want more content. We don't have time to sit here and think of ways to keep it realistic, so let's make some fantasy decisions. They want new emotes and effects. Let's make a fire effect. They want a new emote. Let's have one where they do something bombastic. They want a new illustrious outfit. Let's add one with a crazy mask that makes no sense. It provides a plethora of new emotes, effects, executions, events, and motives to the narrative without requiring a lot of thought, planning, continuity, or realism. So I completely understand why the devs took this route. It's easy, and it's a way to keep the community off their backs where they demand for more content. And, to their credit about this new season, please keep in mind that this new season seems to be a prequel of sorts. It seems to be telling of the golden age of Heathmoor, taking us back in time to the ancient days of Heathmoor. And I think they're implying that in Heathmoor's ancient days, there were dragons, sorcery, and things like that. But as time has gone on into the present day of For Honor, the dragons, fantasy, and magic have all been mostly forgotten, with a few small exceptions here and there. So I'll at least grant them that benefit of the doubt. If so, it's a bit more understandable, if a bit goofy. So I'm willing to let that slide a bit, if that is what they're doing. But with that said, it is a sad omen for Honor. It's a clear sign that the developers are beginning to feel the pressure. The weight of time constraints, a lack of realistic narrative direction, and constant demand for more content from the community who constantly harass the developers for more has become something of a burden. And so they're now having to abandon the creativity of the game where it was more realistic and what it was known for in favor of the lower common denominator. Abandoning the reality of these heroes and instead falling upon the myths, the legends. My expectation for this year is that we will see later seasons dive into the myths and legends of the other factions, not unlike how this new season is more geared toward knightly legend, with clear reference to Arthurian myths and Game of Thrones and the like. Now, I don't think it's a bad idea to explore the legends and myths of these warriors. After all, legend and myths are also a part of the culture and society of these factions. It's essential to appreciate and understand them to get a better idea of the culture as a whole. But with that being said, there is a line that can't be crossed. And that's when the legend overtakes the reality. Do I think For Honor has crossed the line? No. The gameplay is still widely the same, and though some fantasy elements have started popping in, or blatantly, it's nothing that destroys the game as of yet. The addition of fantasy elements can be a way to draw in more players, create opportunities for new cosmetics, content, and ideas, and these are all good aspects to this decision. There is good in this. But if a day comes where For Honor abandons the realism of its cast for the fantastical, when we get warriors who are in no way historically based and completely built on fantasy elements, then I think we will start to see a line crossed that should not be, and may indeed butcher For Honor. Let me give you an example. The first character I think of in terms of this is actually Jormungandr. Jormungandr is one of the few heroes who I have a very hard time making any real connection to any historical figures. No warriors or groups in history connect well to Jormungandr. Even their name and weapon is just a reference to Norse mythology rather than Norse history. However, Jorm didn't necessarily break any rules. Sure, they flirt with that uncrossed line, but they never cross it. Because despite their character not being historically inspired, their moveset, capabilities, and nature do not veer too far off from what the other hero feats and capabilities can do. And okay, before you argue, what about his Ragnarok 4th feat? Consider the fact that knights can put down barriers that passively heal, shinobi can magically throw and retract their Kusarigama every time without fail, Centurion and Jeonjun can apply active shields to all allies regardless of where they are, and Shugoki can heal by cracking someone's spine over their shoulder. I think an area of effect attack that knocks down enemies in its radius isn't pushing things too terribly far outside the realm of what For Honor has shown thus far. So, Jormungandr doesn't quite cross the line, but he comes close. Now let's cross that line. Imagine if we get a Gandalf or wizard style hero who uses a magic staff and casts ranged spells to fight like a mage in Dragon Age or something. That is the line that can't be crossed, and it's the line that I think a lot of the people who aren't happy with these fantasy decisions are afraid of. Not only does it not fit historically, but it alters the entire core gameplay of For Honor. I think that would be a step genuinely too far, and I would not support that. Now, do I think For Honor will go that direction? No. But I do understand the fear some folks in the community have in regards to what they see. To them, adding dragons and the like is equivalent to such a decision. So, I know I've talked on this a while. Let me close on a few final notes. I'm not going to be able to convince many of you of anything, because a lot of this comes down to subjectivity. As my brother calls it, it's the rule of cool. If you can look at dragons and For Honor or magical effects and the like and say, wow, that's really cool and I love it, then you're going to enjoy all of this just fine. But if you look at it and say, wow, this is incredibly off-putting and I don't like it, then the cool factor simply wasn't enough for you to extend your disbelief. That's not only fair, it's understandable. I don't blame community members who aren't excited about fantasy elements being explored. It is surprising. It can be off-putting, and it does create something of a clear dividing line between what the game was advertised as and what we're seeing now in-game. I completely understand that point, but I also see the benefits there. Adding a new fantasy element to the game allows the creators to more easily provide content that will relate to the themes of fantasy, therefore having more regular and constant updates. It will allow for new event mode opportunities and also the chance to attract new players with a love for fantasy. There are pros and cons to this choice, and that is what I'm trying to expose here. Did For Honor maybe go a little too far with its fantasy elements here? Yeah, I would say they did go a step a little too far, at least to the point you can't really backtrack this anymore. Now that dragons are officially a thing, it means the world of fantasy has now been open for further exploration, for good or bad. However, I don't think this is necessarily a game-killing addition, so long as the developers don't cross that unspoken line that I talked about earlier. That line that warns against abandoning relatable, realistic depictions of historical warriors for the sake of what's trendy or eye-catching. They've flirted with this line, but have not fully crossed it as of yet. It is very easy to apply historical warriors with a fantasy backdrop. You can do it. It's possible, as long as the warriors are bound by the rules of realism and the fantasy is just used as a setting, a background for them to play their roles in. And I think as long as they keep it that way, we're golden. And after all, guys, if you really think about it, haven't we heard the same debate before in other moments of For Honor's history? When Marching Fire was released, it caused a divide in the fans where many argued adding that the Wu Lin would kill the game. It didn't. Some argued adding Warmonger would kill this game. It didn't. Some argued by abandoning the original faction war, it would kill this game. It didn't. And every time a new medieval style game came out like Chivalry 2, Mordhau, or even Elden Ring, people said they would kill For Honor. They haven't. Look, For Honor might not be growing at a rapid pace, but it's steady. It's endured through many questionable and risky moments where the future of the game was in question, and this is just another one of those. And I think we'll find that the majority of people who love this game will continue to love it whether it has a few flying dragons in the background or not. Fantasy provides an opportunity, but like all opportunities, there are risks. I think that, so long as the risks are recognized and developers are careful where they tread with them, I see no reason why these additions will destroy the game that we've come to love so much, that we've stuck with it through thick and thin, through dark times and good times. Yes, they did add some very blatant fantasy elements. And yes, this has caused a divide among the fans. My goal here is simply to analyze both sides of the argument and answer two fundamental questions. And here they are. Number one, did For Honor go a little too far with its fantasy? I think I've answered that with yes, they crossed a bit of a line. But the other aspect is, does it hurt the game, kill the game, or is it just bad overall? I don't think so. I don't think it kills anything as of yet. I don't think it hurts anything as of yet. Does it break a little bit of the immersion? Possibly. But keep in mind that a lot of this does come down to the game event modes more than anything. The rest of them are mostly just effects that you can ignore or mythical outfits that you can choose not to purchase. I don't think it hurts the game. I don't think it kills it. So that's just my 2 cents on this matter. I know that y'all have your own positions and opinions on this, and I respect them. My goal here was not to convince you one way or another. It was simply to answer those 2 major questions. Did For Honor go too far with its fantasy, which I think they might have? And 2, is that necessarily a bad thing? And no, I don't think it necessarily is a bad thing. I see the pros and cons of its decision. I just wanted to show you guys what those pros and cons are. But if you really don't like this, I respect it. And if you really do like it, I respect that too. Me personally, I'm excited to see what happens. I'm not the kind of person who likes to rush to judgment just based on what I've seen. Based on what I've seen, I have a lot of high hopes. I think that there can be some good things that come from this. Could there be bad things? Sure, but we gain nothing by being negative. We gain nothing by sitting here pouting and saying, "This isn't what I wanted, it's bad." I'm excited to see what they do with this, and for better or worse, I'm with it to the end. I hope you guys will join me. Thank you guys for watching this video, and I will see you in my next one.
Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind. And therefore, never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for me.